He went silent for months, and that silence was the most disturbing part. Now, what's quietly emerging about Nick Reiner's life behind bars doesn't match the headlines, the assumptions, or what anyone thought they knew. Because this isn't about punishment anymore, it's about what confinement actually does to a person when the doors close and the world stops watching. The moment Nick Reiner stepped inside, the illusion shattered faster than anyone expected. There was no gradual adjustment period, no easing into confinement, no soft landing where time slowed gently. According to people familiar with those first days, reality hit immediately, and it hit without mercy. Whatever people on the outside imagined about privilege, recognition, or protection evaporated the second the doors closed behind him. Inside, a last name doesn't explain you. It marks you. This is why this story matters, and it becomes clear within minutes. Celebrity cases usually end when the verdict is read. Public interest fades. Headlines move on. But what happens after that moment, the psychological, emotional, and physical unraveling is rarely examined. And in Nick's case, what's unfolding behind the walls challenges nearly every assumption people make about confinement, accountability, and survival. From the start, insiders say Nick understood something most people don't until it's too late. Nothing inside operates on written rules alone. The real system is invisible. Where you stand, when you speak, when you don't, who looks at you twice, and who deliberately doesn't look at you at all. Every movement carries meaning, and misreading that meaning can change your day in an instant. Nick reportedly struggled early not because he was defiant, but because he didn't yet understand how little margin for error exists. A glance held too long, a comment made too casually, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. These weren't small mistakes. They were signals, and inside, signals spread fast. What made it worse was perception. Not who Nick actually was, but who people believed he represented. Rumors don't trickle in environments like this. They surge. And once a story takes hold, it doesn't need evidence to survive. According to sources, Nick found himself associated with things he insists never happened, labeled by narratives he never had the chance to correct. Explaining only made it worse. Silence didn't always protect him either. This is where the first shock set in. People expected anger, resistance, maybe entitlement. What they didn't expect was withdrawal. Nick reportedly became quieter by the day, not as a strategy, but as a response to pressure he couldn't control. He learned quickly that keeping his head down wasn't enough. Sometimes attention finds you anyway. Insiders describe moments where Nick was targeted not for actions, but for assumptions. Not because of who he was inside, but because of what others thought his presence meant. And in a place where weakness is noticed immediately, being misunderstood can be dangerous. There were incidents early on that left him shaken, not dramatic, not public, but impactful enough to change how he carried himself afterward. What people rarely talk about is the mental strain of that environment. Not chaos, but tension, constant awareness, never fully relaxed, always scanning. Nick reportedly spent hours replaying interactions in his head, dissecting which word or movement shifted the energy against him. That kind of pressure doesn't leave bruises you can point to, but it drains you just as deeply. Sleep became fragmented. Nights stretched longer than days. And with no familiar faces, no grounding context, Nick was left alone with his thoughts in a way he never had been before. According to those close to the situation, this is when the transformation began, not outwardly, but internally. The realization that time wouldn't soften this place. It would test him harder the longer he stayed. And here's the unsettling part. This was only the beginning. Because once the routines set in, once faces became familiar and expectations formed, the real pressure started. Inside, the first weeks are about shock. What follows is about endurance. Nick learned that quickly. And as the days stacked up, one truth became impossible to ignore: this wasn't just confinement. It was a daily negotiation between survival, identity, and silence. And whatever people think they know about his story, this phase alone changed everything that came after. Because what happened next didn't just test Nick's patience, it tested whether he could hold on to himself at all. Once the initial shock faded, something more dangerous took its place. Familiarity. Inside, familiarity doesn't bring comfort, it sharpens expectations. Faces stop being strangers. Routines lock in. And that's when people start watching more closely. According to insiders, This is when Nick Reiner's situation became heavier, not because anything dramatic happened all at once, but because the pressure never let up. This is the phase most people never hear about. The point where nothing feels new anymore, but nothing feels safe either. Nick reportedly realized that staying invisible wasn't a permanent solution. Silence could protect him one day and expose him the next. In an environment driven by rumor, perception becomes currency, and his name carried weight whether he acknowledged it or not. People close to the situation say Nick began getting blamed for incidents he insists had nothing to do with him. Not openly, quietly. His name whispered into conversations he wasn't part of. In places like this, a whispered story doesn't need proof, it only needs repetition. And once it sticks, it follows you everywhere. Nick learned quickly that trying to explain himself backfired. Explanations sound like weakness when no one is listening. Defensiveness draws attention. So he adapted the only way he could. He spoke less. He reacted slower. He learned to absorb tension without showing it. But that restraint came at a cost. What shocked Nick most wasn't hostility, it was unpredictability. One day, someone nods in passing. The next, they won't meet your eyes. Alliances shift without warning. Conversations die mid-sentence. Insiders say living like that keeps your nervous system permanently activated. You're never fully present. You're always anticipating the next change in energy. This constant vigilance took a toll. Mentally first. Nick reportedly spent hours replaying interactions, wondering which moment triggered a shift he couldn't see. That kind of hyper-awareness becomes exhausting fast. There's no reset button. No space to decompress. Just a slow accumulation of stress that follows you everywhere. And then there's the isolation. Not the physical kind, he wasn't alone, but the deeper kind. No one there knew his history in full. No one cared about context or nuance. He wasn't surrounded by people who understood his past or his perspective. He was surrounded by fragments of a story that wasn't his to control. This is where the emotional weight set in. Nights became longer. Sleep came in short, shallow stretches. Without distractions, thoughts spiraled. According to those close to him, Nick began confronting memories he'd never sat with before. Not just about the case, but about his life leading up to it. Choices, patterns, moments he couldn't rewind. And he raced the contradiction. People expected defiance. What emerged instead was restraint. Nick reportedly didn't lash out. He didn't posture. He didn't perform remorse or innocence. He internalized everything. And internalizing pressure in a place like this doesn't make it disappear, it compresses it. There were moments insiders describe as breaking points. Not explosive, quiet. Situations where Nick was forced to endure treatment he says he didn't provoke and couldn't escape. No audience. No pause. Just moments that left him emotionally and physically shaken, with nowhere to explain what happened afterward. This is the part of confinement that rarely makes headlines. Not constant violence. Constant tension. The fear of being misunderstood. The knowledge that silence can be read as guilt, but speaking can be used against you. It's a psychological trap with no clear exit. As the weeks passed, Nick reportedly began moving differently. Slower. More guarded. Like someone bracing for impact even when nothing was happening. His body adapted to the environment before his mind could. Shoulders tense. Eyes down. Energy conserved. And through all of this, one realization hardened. Time wasn't easing the pressure. It was intensifying it. The longer he stayed, the more expectations formed around who people thought he was. The more those assumptions solidified, the harder it became to exist without friction. But just when it seemed like this pressure would crush him, something unexpected happened, something that shifted how people inside started seeing Nick and how he started seeing himself.
This is one of my favorite reads when I'm sitting on by the campfire or like relaxing in Malibu. I'm gonna go kill that.
What happened next caught even the people watching Nick Reiner most closely off guard. Instead of hardening into anger or collapsing under the pressure, he did something far less visible and far more complicated. He pulled inward, not in defeat, but in recalibration. According to insiders, this was the moment Nick stopped reacting to the environment and started quietly adapting to it. This shift didn't announce itself. There were no confrontations, no declarations, no sudden change in behavior that would draw attention. It showed up in small, almost invisible choices. Nick spoke even less, but when he did, his tone was measured. He stopped trying to explain anything about his past. He stopped correcting assumptions. He conserved words like a limited resource. What surprised people around him was how this inward turn changed his interactions. Insiders say Nick began listening more than talking. In a place where everyone is constantly posturing, listening stands out. Not advice, not storytelling, just quiet attention. A few people began approaching him not because of who they thought he was, but because he didn't interrupt, didn't judge, and didn't escalate. That attention came with risk. Any visibility inside can turn against you fast. Nick had to balance being human with staying unnoticed. Too distant, and you look suspicious. Too present, and you draw interest you don't want. People close to him say he walked that line carefully, adjusting day by day, reading rooms the way others read weather. Another unexpected change surfaced late at night. Nick reportedly began writing again. Not letters meant for the outside world. Not statements. Private pages. Pages no one else sees. According to those familiar with this habit, writing became the only place where he didn't have to measure his words. No rumors. No consequences. Just unfiltered thought. Those pages weren't about rewriting the story. They weren't about convincing anyone of anything. They were about memory. Conversations replayed. Moments paused and examined. Regret without performance. Reflection without audience. In an environment designed to strip identity down to routine, writing became his way of holding on to a sense of self. This reframed everything. Nick wasn't just surviving day to day. He was processing. Slowly. Quietly. And that kind of internal work is harder in confinement than it looks. There's no distance from your thoughts. No distractions strong enough to drown them out. You sit with everything. But this didn't make life easier. In some ways, it made it heavier. Processing brings awareness. Awareness brings weight. Insiders say Nick became more introspective, more aware of consequences, more conscious of how fast life can collapse when everything familiar disappears. Physically, the strain showed. He moved like someone constantly bracing, not because of one incident, but because of repeated pressure that never fully released. He lost weight, slept less, held himself differently. His body adapted to stress even when his mind tried to stay controlled. Nick reportedly stopped complaining altogether, not because conditions improved, but because speaking up only brought more attention. Silence became protection, even when it cost him emotionally. This withdrawal wasn't coldness. It was conservation, and he erased the contradiction that unsettled people around him. Instead of becoming more aggressive, Nick grew quieter and more reflective. That unsettled some. In environments like this, people expect reactions. When someone doesn't react, it creates uncertainty. Yet, this internal shift didn't shield him completely. Insiders say there were still encounters he couldn't avoid. Moments where tension cornered him and he had to endure situations he insists he didn't provoke. He didn't retaliate. Not out of fear, but calculation. Reacting emotionally would only paint a bigger target on his back. This phase reshaped him, piece by piece. Not dramatically, subtly. The grind didn't explode, it eroded. And that erosion forced him to confront something deeper than survival. Who he was becoming when stripped of distractions, defenses, and identity markers. But just as Nick settled into this fragile balance, one night changed everything, and what followed left marks that never fully faded.
I think the bonding came not from the story itself, but from the fact that we were working on a movie together, and I could see him and his, I would think, in the form that he could express himself the best.
There was one night that insiders say drew a clear line between before and after, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because of how quietly it ended. According to people familiar with what followed, a situation escalated faster than Nick Reiner could step away from. No warning, no space to recalibrate. Just a sudden shift that left him overwhelmed in a place where control is always limited. What makes this moment difficult to pin down is how little was said about it afterward. There were no public records meant for headlines. No spectacle, just procedure. Nick was reportedly taken out, assessed, checked over, and kept under observation until it was clear he could function again. Then, just as quickly, routine resumed as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. People close to Nick say that after that night, nothing felt neutral anymore. Every sound carried weight. Every pause in conversation felt loaded. He stopped assuming any moment was safe and started managing time in smaller increments. Not days, hours, sometimes minutes. Survival shifted from endurance to navigation. Nick adjusted immediately. He altered his routines, changed when he moved, where he stood, who he spoke to. Even basic tasks became calculated. Not out of panic, but awareness. He learned that predictability could be both protection and liability, so he stayed flexible, alert, quiet. What weighed on him most wasn't fear. It was exhaustion, the kind that settles into your body when your nervous system never powers down. His shoulders stayed tense. Sleep came in fragments and never felt restorative. Insiders say this was when he truly grasped the emotional cost of confinement, not isolation, but constant vigilance. Conversations shortened. Eye contact faded. Trust became something he no longer offered casually. The little openness he had left vanished almost overnight. Not because he didn't care, but because caring carried risk. As days blurred together, loneliness took over in a new way. Not the absence of people, but the absence of understanding. Nick reportedly stopped expecting kindness. When a day passed without conflict, it felt like luck, not normalcy. That mindset changes how you see everything. You stop hoping. You start bracing. Inside, he spent long stretches alone with his thoughts. Memories replayed on a loop. Things said, things unsaid, decisions that couldn't be undone. With no distractions, those thoughts grew heavier. People close to him say this is when regret began showing not in words, but in withdrawal. And then there's the quiet insistence Nick repeats. Not loudly, not defiantly, just firmly. He says he is not guilty. He doesn't add detail. He doesn't argue. He doesn't try to convince. He treats guilt as a legal fact, not a narrative, and that distinction matters deeply to him. When pressed, he shuts down. Silence, again, feels safer than explanation. In a place where words spread fast and context disappears faster, restraint becomes survival. This has cost him socially. Some read it as coldness, others as arrogance. Nick reportedly accepts that trade-off. Insiders say he's hinted carefully that his awareness during key moments wasn't intact, that his state of mind was compromised, influenced, clouded. He doesn't name causes. He doesn't accuse. He frames it as loss of clarity rather than denial of responsibility. To him, intent and awareness are not the same thing. That belief isolates him further. Nuance doesn't survive long inside. People want simple stories, clean motives, clear villains. Nick believes reality was messy, and that belief becomes both his shield and his burden. What remains now is waiting. Not with optimism, not with despair, with numb patience. He no longer asks when things will change. He asks if they ever will. This is where the story pauses, not ends. Behind closed doors, without headlines or commentary, Nick exists in a suspended state, waiting for truth to surface, waiting for time to pass, waiting for something to shift. Because whatever people think they know, they don't see the nights that stretch endlessly, the vigilance that never shuts off, or the quiet erosion of identity that confinement brings. This isn't a story with answers yet. It's a story with questions. And those questions are still very much alive. Nick Reiner's story doesn't resolve neatly, and that discomfort is exactly why it matters. What's unfolding behind closed doors isn't a redemption arc or a cautionary headline, it's a slow, human unraveling shaped by isolation, pressure, and unanswered questions. The version of Nick that exists now is not the one people argue about online. It's someone navigating survival in silence, carrying a truth he believes hasn't fully surfaced, and learning how confinement reshapes identity one day at a time. This isn't about excusing or condemning. It's about recognizing how quickly life can collapse into routine, vigilance, and waiting, how nuance disappears once narratives harden, and how the loudest judgments are often made farthest from the reality they describe. Whether Nick's version of events will ever be fully understood remains uncertain. What is clear is that confinement doesn't pause a person, it transforms them. Quietly, permanently, and whatever comes next will arrive without spectacle, shaped by time rather than noise. For now, this story remains unfinished. Not because the truth doesn't exist, but because it's still moving slowly, invisibly toward a moment when it can no longer stay buried. Subscribe for more deep, investigative stories that look beyond the headlines and into the silence where the real questions live.